Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video we'll be painting the Warcry Catacombs wooden barricades. In this video I'll go through all the paints and process I used to paint the barricade pieces. At the end I'll put links in the description so you can get the paint recipe for free on my website, and also links to all the paints I used with up to 20% discount on the RRP. I'm super excited to get this terrain tabletop ready, so let's get on with it and paint some awesome terrain. To prime these pieces I used the Army Painter Necrotic Flesh aerosol spray. It gave a nice coat, dried pretty quick, but to be sure I always leave these overnight, but you don't have to. Main thing is give them a good shake for at least 2 minutes, make sure it's nice and warm, and follow the instructions on the bottle. Once primed and dried, I was going to start with the first base coat, and that's the Contrast Militarum Green. This was going to be for the little pieces of stone and brickwork, and I wanted this to match the main buildings I painted, which you can see in a separate video. So I just used the paint straight out the pot with a decent medium-sized brush so I can keep it nice and neat. And then I start applying it all over the pieces of masonry there. And a good tip is just to end your brush stroke where you want most of the paint to end up. So in those deep recesses and shaded areas, I just try to end there. The contrast paints are so good, if it starts to pool in the flatter, more kind of raised areas, you can just spread it out, and it's pretty easy to work with and move around. So I did that on all the pieces of terrain, and then let that to dry before moving on to the next stage. You can see where I'm going a little bit over the edge where it meets the wood, and that's okay. If anything, that's going to add a little bit of shade, and kind of where the wood meets the masonry, it's going to make it look like it belongs. You can see there, it's not overly neat, but that's fine, plenty for what we need. Next we move on to the wooden parts, and for that I use the contrast paint Wildwood. Gave it a good shake. You've really got to shake these paints to make sure all the pigments mix together well. And again, I just used it straight out the bottle. For miniatures I wouldn't do this, but for terrain I find it's perfectly okay. So I put some on the brush, and I start where I want most of the paint, in those recesses, work it out all across, and then remembering to finish my brush where I want the paint to pool the most. So I was taking a little bit more care here, because I didn't want the wildwood to go over the straps and the sharpened edges of the wood, and it's quite a dark paint, so once that goes on it's harder to kind of correct. So I did that for all the pieces. And then as we can see, these are the finished terrain pieces, and with that wood they're already starting to be brought to life, and as a backdrop that nice dark colour is going to let all those light bits kind of stand out. Next we went on to the leather straps and the sharpened piece of the wood, and for that I used the Contrast Snakebite Leather. Again, a good shake, and I should really be careful opening these pots above the terrain like that. And now again, straight out of the pot with a medium-sized brush. It's pointy enough to get some good detail, and I just start going over all those straps. As this is a lighter paint, it doesn't matter so much if any of this runs onto that wildwood, and again, where the two materials meet each other, having that extra shade is going to help it look like it belongs there. Next I started on those sharpened pointy bits, and I kind of started at the top and then worked my way down so that the brush stroke would end where the bark and the exposed wood underneath would meet, and I did that on all the pieces. So even with just those 3 base colours put on, these are already starting to look good, and you can see the wildwood and snakebite leather work really well together. With the wood done, I moved on to the skeletons, and for that another contrast paint, this time Skeleton Horde. Again, a really good shake to get that mixed up. So with the same brush, I'm just being quite generous with how much I apply here. I'm putting lots of it in amongst the ribs there, under the ribs, the neck, making sure the eye sockets are filled in, and then just being a bit careful where the skeletons meet the wood. Once that's dried, you could highlight the skeletons with some Ashabti Bone layer paint, but I preferred it just as it was, so I left it with the Skeleton Horde contrast, and then I felt it merged into the background a lot better that way. Next I took some Plague Bearer Green contrast paint, and I wanted to use this to just put some little dots of green along the piece. and I tried to pick out the base of the wood and areas where two different materials met, just to give a grimy, grungy feel. Including a little bit of green like this is really good to tie these scattered terrain pieces into the kind of main buildings too. I imagined that where the skeletons had been rotting away against that wood, there'd certainly be a build-up of kind of grime and grunge around there, so I made sure to add quite a lot there. And this also helps give a little bit of shade and frame those pieces as well. Once that had all dried, I moved on to a base paint now, again by Citadel, and this is the Mournfang Brown. And I took a rough brush that I could do a little bit of dry brushing with, and wanted to go over just to give a little bit of red colour to that wood there. This is, again, it's a nice reddy brown, so it's very subtle, and having that red against the green is a really good contrast. So I loaded the brush just straight out the pot, and then made sure the bristles were loaded, worked away most of the paint on the paper towel, and that's really important for dry brushing like this. And then I just, as carefully as I could, just went along all the brown bark and gave it a really light dry brushing. The final stage for the wood was to take some Citadel layer paint, a Shabty Bone, give it a good shake and really make sure it's all mixed together, and just taking it straight out of the pot, working it into the bristles and getting rid of most of that paint on a paper towel. And then I've got a different brush now, a bit of a better quality for dry brushing, and I'm just working my way along all that bark there to give a highlight. These terrain pieces have got some really nice texture, and it's good to go in all different directions with the brush. If you can go in a circular motion, you're going to cover most of it. With the wood complete and the paint dry, I moved on to the metallic work, and that was for these pieces here. And so I used lead belcher, gave it a really good shake, and just made sure that it was kind of mixed together really well before I started using it. And just using it from the lid of the pot, I just started applying that as a base coat over all the metal pieces that you can see. Now I was being really careful here where the wood met with that metal, so that I didn't kind of overlap it, because I didn't want to have to correct that. And just took my time and just made sure I covered every angle and every piece of that metal. Now for a subtle highlight, I took some Vallejo 0.997 silver. Really good shake again, and this time I'm just using my wet palette just to put a little dot there in the corner. Sometimes the wet palette and metallic paints don't work well together, but I'm only using a tiny bit here. So with a smaller brush now, I just apply it, load up the bristles, and I really want to get rid of as much as I can on that paper towel before I start applying it to the terrain piece. Now I'm focusing on the tips and the very edges, and very slowly and gently building up a layer of highlight there. So less is definitely more here, and I'm taking my time building up the highlight. You can always add more, but at this stage it's going to be difficult to correct those mistakes and take it away. So just very subtle, adding that highlight there. We're going to cover it and make it more grungy. And here you can see just how subtle that highlight is. We just want it on the very edges and the tips there. Next we took our Agrax Earthshade, and this is what we're going to use just to dirty that metal up and give it a good wash all over. And again I took it straight out the pot here and just worked it over all the metal areas, making sure to end my brush where I wanted most of that shade to finish. On those raised areas where I didn't want it to pool, I just used the brush to kind of spread that around. And this works really well. And there we go, you can see how that Agrax Earthshade has really dirtied that metal up for us. So I continued that across all the other terrain pieces, and especially with these chains I made sure to get right in the links and where the two metals overlapped and where they met the wood. And this was really going to help to kind of frame those pieces and kind of, although keeping them all tied together as one piece, it's going to make all the elements kind of stand out on their own, which is really nice. Once that had completely dried, I took some Vallejo 0.851 bright orange paint, and this is going to be for the kind of rust effect. And I'm being quite subtle this time with the rust, not too much. So I apply the paint on my wet palette, and then with a kind of old bristly brush, I'm just dabbing it in, and then I'm going to work most of that paint off on a paper towel. So with most of that paint taken off, I just went for a stippling effect, where the two different metals either met or overlapped, around the rivets and where any of those edges had been damaged and scratched. It's easy to go over the top with this, so I just took my time and built it up slowly. I didn't want it to be too orange because that would clash with the different wood tones that I've used, and I wanted it to still look like kind of metal that was sharp with a touch of highlight and just some areas of rust. To finish those rust areas, I took this old brush and now I wanted to leave a little bit more paint on just to give a few more pronounced spots of rust above the kind of dry stipple effect I'd already put on. So I'm just dabbing it on very carefully, just trying to get a few bits to kind of stand out there. And there we go. Not too much orange, that's not clashing too much with the wood, but I did want to keep that metallic look, so I'm going to do one final highlight with the .997 Vallejo silver. So I added a tiny bit to the wet palette, and then with an old brush I worked it into the bristles and again removed as much as I could on that paper towel. Then I just picked out the most kind of raised bits, and anywhere there's perhaps a little bit too much orange, or where the orange of the metal met the kind of browny red, I just put a little kind of highlight there just to differentiate the two. And I think that really made it stand out a little bit more, framed it, but also kept it kind of all in cohesion. And with that final highlight dried, that piece is complete. I'm really happy with how these pieces of terrain turned out, and I think they're going to look great up against those buildings that we painted earlier. I hope this video's helped you with your painting, and don't forget you can get the recipe for free on my website. I'll put a link down in the description, and there'll also be links in the description to all the paints I used, and you can get those from Element Games or Amazon. Please like if you like the video, subscribe for more Warcry content like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.